And this time on, continuing on Breakfast Daily, we want to talk on the health segment about meningitis. Now, this is something that has been with us as long as I can remember. As long as I knew about diseases, I've always heard of meningitis. What is meningitis really? And why have we not been able to get rid of it? And why does it seem to flare up in certain seasons? Let's talk to Dr. Kelvin Owusu, who is the Medical Director for Optimal Care Diagnostics. Dr. Kelvin.
David.
Morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Very well. And
Fantastic.
you?
I'm great, thank you. It's good
Fabulous.
to have you here. Yeah, so meningitis. What is meningitis?
Well, simply put, is an inflammation of the meninges.
Okay.
Now, the meninges is the covering of the brain. I mean, you've heard about gray matter, white matter,
Yes,
a lot of spinal cord, etc. Now, all of these things are wrapped in the meninges.
Oh.
You know, if you go into it, there are three different meninges, but it's not important. The meninges wrap the brain.
Okay.
You know, so in a sense, they protect the brain. Now, when these meninges get inflamed, they get infected, then we say you have meningitis. So that's simply what it is.
Okay. So usually when we see the brain or a picture of the brain, it seems to be like convoluted, undulating, thing. So the meninges is covering all of that?
Yes.
Is that what it is?
Yes. So I mentioned that there are three different meninges, meningeal layers. There's, the brain is inside the skull.
Yes.
Or in the case of the spinal cord, it's inside the vertebrae.
Okay.
The vertebral canal.
Yeah.
Now, there's a layer of the meninges that covers the bone, right beneath the bone. It's right there. Then there's a layer of the meninges that forms part of the convolution.
Okay.
And then the fluid you call the spinal fluid. So the meninges covers the brain.
Okay.
So whether it's
part of the convolutions or it's
underneath the bone.
Yeah.
So in other words, the brain matter does not touch the bone.
Yeah.
Okay. So the meninges covers the surface of the bone that's supposed to be in contact with the brain. And a different meningeal layer covers the brain tissue itself. So that between the brain tissue and the bone are two meningeal layers. There are actually three, but like I said, we are not going to be too technical.
Okay. So now every time we see an itis at the end of a disease or the end of something, it usually refers to an inflammation, right? Okay. What is it that will make this meninges inflame?
Well, there are so many things, and to answer a question you haven't asked, that you mentioned it in your intro, why haven't you been able to get rid of meningitis? Because there are so many different things that causes meningitis. I mean, bacteria, viruses, fungi, even drugs. Yes, and so there are so many different things that can cause meningitis, that can cause the meninges to become inflamed. Now, when everything is working as it should, the brain is protected, by something we call the blood-brain barrier. Now, I'm an Ashanti, so I have to really take my time when I'm pronouncing these things, because
blood-brain
barrier. Okay. so the things that are going on in the blood should not necessarily affect the brain. Okay. But sometimes, as is expected, it doesn't always work like that. So infections are able to cross from the blood into the brain. I mean, so long as food can pass from the blood into the brain, in the same regard, some infection can also pass from the blood into the brain. And so that is one way that infections settle in the meninges. Sometimes, maybe due to some trauma, you might get a cut, a wound, a fracture of the brain, and then external the germs cannot enter directly through the cut or the opening. Sometimes things would happen. There may be a puncture. You may have had a medical procedure, a lumbar puncture. Then you might get an infection introduced into the brain. And so there are so many different ways that you can get infected. But one other key way is also malnutrition and immunosuppression. Because the two are linked. When you're malnourished, obviously your immune system is not working well, which means that then your blood-brain barrier, you see how I have to slow down when I'm going. Then the BBB is not as efficient, so things can cross. When you're immunosuppressed, when we say you're immunosuppressed, it means that something is preventing your immune system from functioning optimally. That something could be an infection like HIV, it could be cancer, it could be some medication that is suppressing your immune system for another purpose or for another reason. Maybe you have had an organ transplant, so they need to suppress your immune system. that act can expose you then to an infection elsewhere as well. And so all these are factors that come into play that make you more likely to get meningitis. And if you're also too young or too old for that matter, so extremes of age, you are at risk of meningitis. Wow. Yes, because again, your blood-brain barrier is compromised. In the very young, it's not fully developed or it's not fully matured yet. Yeah. And in the very old, well, it's deteriorating. So there are so many different reasons why somebody might get or might present with meningitis. And in our setting, in Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm sure you've heard about a meningitis belt. Yes. So occasionally, every now and then, we hear of CSM, cerebrospinal meningitis. Yes. So that has a seasonal component. And when the weather is favorable, especially when it's very, very hot, you get an outbreak of CSM. So you typically find it happening in the north. Yeah. Then occasionally it comes down south when people are traveling up and down. Yeah. And then the other aspect that also makes meningitis a problem is social life. Poverty plays a heavy role in meningitis.
How so?
Well, overcrowding. Some meningitis, some of the germs that cause meningitis are proliferated when there's overcrowding. Okay. You know, so when somebody has a cough or a cold, you said the meningitis, some of the meningitis germs stay in the nasopharynx, the nose area. So as you cough or as you breathe out, as you talk, it gets spread, and then somebody sitting next to you can also catch it. So when there's overcrowding and poor ventilation, it helps in the spread of some of the meningitis germs as well.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier, I'm just curious because it, piqued my curiosity. You said about a lumbar puncture.
Yes.
That it can cause meningitis if you have a puncture in your lumbar. Now, your lumbar is the lowest part of your your backbone. Yes. Right? How does that affect your brain?
Well, the spinal cord is a continuation of the brain, pretty much. Okay. So the brain, the spinal cord is one. So that's why when we say central nervous system, it includes your brain and your spinal cord. Okay. And it's the same structure, pretty much, that continues from the brain into the cord. And the fluid that goes around your brain, that's spinal fluid, or is the same fluid that's also in the spinal cord. Okay. And so once you are going to do a lumbar puncture for any reason, you need to take all the precautions, because if something should go wrong in the lumbar puncture, the infection can easily travel upwards into the brain. Okay. Because it's one system actually.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks for that.
So that's why as medics we don't take lumbar puncture lightly at all. I mean, it's something that, of course, you can get a lot of information, and in fact, you cannot make a diagnosis of meningitis without doing a lumbar puncture.
I see. Okay.
Yes, because that's the fluid around the brain. Let me backtrack. I mentioned that between the meningeal covering the undersurface of the skull and the one covering the convoluted parts of the brain, that's where the fluid is. Which means that whatever is going on in the meninges, you will see it in the fluid. So you take a sample of the fluid, whatever is in the fluid will tell you what's happening in the meninges, or even it gives you the brain picture. And so if you took that fluid and you saw bacteria, then obviously you know that there is a bacterial meningitis of a sort, and you can go deeper and find out which particular bacteria is actually causing this, because that will have implication on the particular antibiotic you are going to give. If you took the fluid and you found fungi, obviously you're not going to treat that person with antibacterial. There's a different regimen for that. Okay. If you happen to have the technology to detect viruses, and you found the virus in the fluid, obviously you treat it differently. Well. Okay. And so the spinal fluid is very, very important in diagnosing meningitis. But when it comes to children, or in fact infants under 1 year old, when you report to the hospital with fever, any of the symptoms, fever, vomiting, irritability, the child is refusing to feed, they would usually do a septic screen where they would take blood to find out what's going on. Of course, they'll check for malaria, which is very common. They'll check for other bacterial infections. And then they'll also go a step further and do a lumbar puncture to find out what's happening in the brain. Okay. So that then they would have to, if they find whatever is going on, then they would start treatment. So and that's why I say that poverty is also plays a major role, because if for instance, the parent is not, the child is not on insurance, and then you've taken all these samples, and the samples never get work done, you really don't have a diagnosis. What are you going to do? And so you are stuck, you know. So poverty plays a role in getting the disease and also in the treatment of the disease. So it's a real big issue.
Okay. Now, referring to treatment of the disease, I'm assuming that if you're treating it, it means you can cure it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what would be the regimen typically within our environment for curing meningitis?
Well, it starts with the diagnosis, the right diagnosis. Of course, there are common, some causes are more common than others. And thankfully, in our EPI, Expanded Program on Immunization, some of the common causes of meningitis is actually covered in the EPI. Okay. So when you take your child for the 6-week vaccination, 6, 10, 14-week vaccination, there's a vaccine in there that deals with the H influenza type of infection. Okay. Because that, even though you are hearing influenza would usually be a respiratory infection. Yes. That particular bacteria can, or in fact, it's one of the commonest causes of meningitis as well. And and so there's a vaccine in the EPI that deals with that particular one. And as the child grows older, now there's a new one which was introduced about 4 years ago. And when the child is 1 year and then 1.5 years, they go in for Men-A vaccination as well, which is trying to tackle another cause of meningitis. You know, those are the common ones. Then periodically, you have the CSM vaccination also going on. Now, we don't do CSM vaccination routinely across the country because it's not indicated. But whenever there's an outbreak, then they'll roll out the vaccination program to try and keep it under control. So that takes care of the common meningitis causes. But when a child comes in, or when anybody comes in with symptoms of meningitis, and you want to find out, you have to do the lumbar puncture and find out what is causing it. And depending on the cause, then you can have the specific treatment regimen. Some of the regimen are short, some of them are long, depending on the cause. If you had something like a fungal infection in your brain, that's a serious matter. Usually that will be related to an immunosuppression as well. And so you'd want to find out why, because it's not common, you don't typically, fungi are big organisms. Okay. So it's difficult for such a big organism to cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay. So if you have something like that happening, you need to find out why is that happening. And then most likely it's because the person is immunocompromised. And so you want to find out what is causing immunocompromisation, because even if you treated the fungi and you don't deal with the immunocompromisation, it will still come back. And so you want to tackle both of them at the same time so that we can get to the bottom of it. I see. Sometimes cancer can also seed. When we say cancer can seed, it can spread onto the meninges. So you may do the lumbar puncture, you may not find any bacteria, no fungi, no viruses, but then you might find cells that would suggest that there's cancer going on. So now you have to find out where is this cancer coming from so that you can then treat it appropriately. I see. Wow. So meningitis is a big, yes. On in there.
At this time, of course, vaccinations are a very big conversation that we're having. Yes. I'm just wondering, considering the fact that we have, so many potential causes of meningitis, is there no way we can have, an expansive cocktail of a vaccine, so that when you take that one as a little child, you're done for life?
A super pill or super drug.
Something like that.
You see, medicine is all about cost and benefit. Okay. And cost, when we say cost, we are talking about, yes, cost in terms of cash, and also cost in terms of how much is it going to cause damage to the individual. Okay. Is it going to do more harm than good? So now if there was such a vaccine or such a pill available, how expensive would it be? How accessible would it be? Because even in our EPI that is free, we don't have 100% coverage. And this is even a free program where you're literally just working with your baby and they get vaccinated. Sometimes you may pay a token for 1 or 2 services, but generally free. We are not getting 100% coverage. So now if you bring in this super vaccine, which is now going to be expensive, how many people are going to actually access it? So then the cost may be prohibitive. Okay. Now, but let's even remove the cash aspect aside. How beneficial would this one be? Because sometimes you also have something with interaction between drug interactions or vaccine interactions, which may actually be counterproductive. And so that's probably why we don't have that super vaccine yet. And then also, how common are all these other ones that you are trying to tackle? Okay. So when you are dealing with these, so let's even take COVID. Now, if you look at how infectious COVID has been, it has shown in how quickly people have been able to put resources together and develop vaccines to try and deal with it. So how common are some of these other types of meningitis that require that much investment to try and get a vaccine against it? You know, and so all these are questions that need to be answered before vaccines go into development.
So looking at the fact that Big Pharma is not based in Africa. One.
True.
Number two, meningitis seems to be, by virtue of circumstance, to be along the equator, generally speaking, and in poorer nations along the equator. So then we are hard done by.
So that's why I started by saying that the cost aspect is number one. When it comes to cost, is cash. So if you have the money to fund the research, to fund the development, by all means, somebody will be ready to develop it. However, thankfully, the commonest causes of meningitis are not limited to Africa only. You know, so you have H. influenza, you have meningococcal meningitis, and pneumococcal. All these ones are worldwide, and so we have vaccines against those three major players. You know, but when it comes to CSM, which is typically along the what's it called, the equator, that is where we have a bit of a challenge, and I suspect that's part of the reason why we don't have a wide rollout of CSM vaccination all the time. It's only done during outbreaks to try and minimize the impact. You know, because I'm sure there's a financial component to all of these things.
Quick one before we go. How do people generally stay away from CSM?
It's pretty much the same thing. So I mentioned overcrowding. And then reporting early. So you see, a lot of the people in the belt are well educated about CSM. So when there's an outbreak of CSM, they usually tend to catch it early. You know, because the person comes in with headache, with disorientation, with fever, sometimes vomiting, and then neck stiffness. You know, so once you notice these things, you quickly know that there's something going on, and then there are protocols that are activated, and then vaccines are rolled out immediately. The challenge comes in when the outbreak sort of travels down south, because we in the south,
we don't really know it.
We don't really know it. Yes, you know, so it presents a bit of a challenge. But generally, avoid. The interesting thing is that the protocols we have in place for COVID are similar to what will prevent, because hand washing, avoiding contact, obviously face mask, and so one of the positive outcomes of COVID is that we're actually having less of these things. So if you realize, in the past year, we've not had as many.
Talked about meningitis
and even upper respiratory tract infection. We have not had as many outbreaks of common cold, because everybody's washing their hands, everybody's wearing their mask. When the children went back to school, there was a bit of an increase, but well, it's sort of
to be expected.
Yes.
Of course. Thank you very much. How can people reach you?
Well, I'm on social media, Kelvin Owusu MD, so you can reach me over there.
Fantastic.